Welcome, everyone. This is Dr. Jim, and you are listening to the Forensic Investigator Podcast. And I am your host. Today, the topic is going to be about victimology and suspectology assessments. We'll focus primarily on the victimology side first and see how the time goes. And everything allowing, we'll go into the suspectology as well. Throughout my podcast sessions previous to this, I have repeatedly emphasized the importance of conducting accurate and thorough victimology assessments. This episode is dedicated primarily to that topic, what victimology is and why it plays such a critical role in the investigation of sexual assaults, homicides, and at times other serious crimes. Plus, as time allows, as I stated before, I will transition into the theoretical premise of the development of suspects through suspectology. In my death investigation for detectives episode that aired on June 17th, 2026, I define victimology as it is outlined in my most recent book called Homicide, Guidelines for Conducting Homicide Investigations by Detectives and for Detectives, where I have an entire chapter devoted to the subject. The following summary of that chapter was written by a colleague who was a former member of the FBI Behavioral Science Unit. And I'm going to quote for you his definition. When a victim is murdered, investigators must recognize information throughout the investigation that helps explain why the victim was targeted. Understanding why and when the victim was selected can guide the investigators toward potential suspects. Learning who the victim was, how they lived, their personality, their behavioral baseline, and activities immediately prior to the homicide are all essential in understanding motive. This information is developed through interviews with family, friends, and associates, and by constructing an accurate timeline of the victim's movements. Understanding the motive also enhances interview and interrogation strategies and is valuable for prosecutors and juries at trial. End of quote. From an investigative standpoint, there is also a strong statistical reason why victimology assessments matter. According to FBI data, approximately 60 to 70% of homicide victims in the United States knew their attacker. When victim-offender relationships are identified, which isn't in all of the cases, only about 20 to 25% of the homicides involve actual strangers. Victims are most commonly killed by acquaintances, such as friends or neighbors, or by intimate partners or family members. In fact, nearly 90% of female homicide victims that were killed by men are killed by someone they know. Now, key findings on victim-offender relationships include the following. The data consistently shows that approximately 35 to 40% of the homicide victims are killed by acquaintances. Roughly 25 to 30 are killed by intimate partners or family members. And that stranger homicides account for a smaller percentage, and as I stated before, could be as low as 20 to 25%. And that again is when relationships have been properly identified during the course of the investigation. Now, most homicides arise from disputes or arguments rather than random acts. A single limitation in crime data is that many homicide records still list the victim-offender relationship as unknown. And until the reporting of crime data becomes a mandatory function for police agencies in this country, the present voluntary system continues with data that is going to be unreliable and severely lacking in many cases. All of these patterns that we find reinforce a well-known investigative principle, and that is, to know your victim is to know your offender. Now, what do we need to know in order to do this properly? A thorough victimology assessment seeks to understand who the victim was in every context of their life. Now, this includes, but is not limited to, age, sex, race, education, physical or mental limitations, lifestyle, personality, demeanor, living arrangements, employment, income, different types of relationships, social status, family dynamics, substance abuse or use, fears, habits, forms of transportation, religious or political involvement, hobbies, recent stressors in their lives, significant life changes, last known activities, and of course, all recent contacts. So we look at all of these things in our development of the assessment. And in my book, Homicide, Guidelines for Conducting Homicide Investigations by Detectives and for Detectives, we have listed out a series of things and divided it up into sections. Number one, the victim as a person. Identify the victim within their family, social, and work environments. Determine the marital status and relationship histories that exist. Identify secretive or undisclosed relationships. Assess religious or political involvements. Evaluate the age, the education level, and the neighborhood context. Number two, activities and lifestyle. We must determine involvement in unlawful activity. Assess financial stress, such as gambling or living beyond one's means. Determine whether the victim was specifically targeted or simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. Identify any mental health concerns or, as mentioned before, substance abuse issues. Identify all close friends, associates, and use of social and dating platforms. Number three, personality. Gather descriptions from family and friends and assess her temperament, social tendencies, and hobbies. Number four, consider surroundings and recent events. Determine safety awareness and openness to strangers. Identify prior victimization or possible threats. And identify triggering or high-stress events that may have occurred just prior to the death. Number five, we look at victim risk factors, and we have what are called victim risk levels, of low, medium, or high. They reflect situational and lifestyle elements that influence the vulnerability of that person. I'll get into that a little more later. However, on to number six, hidden lives. Every individual has what we call professional life, public life, private life, and sometimes secret aspects of life. Investigators should build a detailed timeline covering at least 72 hours prior to death and those relationships. They should subpoena relevant social media records, identify any conflicts, who were the last contacts, and who are the beneficiaries of the victim's death. 7. We have also case-specific considerations, where the investigator should critically examine why this victim was selected, why the crime occurred in this specific location, why and how did the offender approach and harm the victim, and why in this particular manner? What specific injuries or methods were involved, and why was the position of the body reflecting the way it is? Number 8, environment and employment. Evaluate residential and workplace risk factors. Assess the exposure to high crime areas based on maybe residence, employment, or their travel routes to employment or to go shopping. Additional investigative factors would include to identify recent associations and the depth of those relationships. Assess whether the victim contributed to their victimization, maybe through behavior or circumstances. Determine whether the crime was impulsive, spontaneous, or planned. Identify indicators of maybe a staged crime scene, a scene that was altered in order to misdirect the investigators. I will have a session on just that topic with my colleague Steve Chancellor at a later date. Now, in the victimology assessment summary, we need to know that when a homicide motive is not immediately apparent, victimology often provides the most direct path to understanding the motive, developing suspects, and prioritizing those investigative leads. So information must be gathered from multiple sources. Family members may be influenced by grief. Friends may be reluctant or incomplete in their disclosures. Co-workers, neighbors, and acquaintances frequently provide more objective insight. But no single source should ever stand alone as you document and verify all of it. Tools such as the FBI's General Assessment Questionnaire can assist investigators by systematically collecting information from those who knew the victim. This tool can be obtained by requesting it from the FBI. Victims' risk should always be evaluated across, as I stated before, the levels of low, medium, or high. And in that, we consider the environment, the circumstance or circumstances, and of course the behavior of the actors involved. Ultimately, understanding the victim allows investigators to better understand the offender, how the crime unfolded, why it occurred, and who is most likely responsible. Now, when we go back to the risk factors for victimology, one thing I want you to keep in mind as we talk about this is that victim behavior and circumstances generally fall into just the 3 levels, low, medium, or high. And these levels are evaluated along what's known as a victimology continuum, which considers the victim's environment situation, the situation itself, and the circumstances. Now, I have taken this model from a book called Cold Case Methodology by Cooper and King, and it has remained quite prominent over the years. And it is one of the most useful frameworks that investigators have to utilize. So, when you're assessing victim risk, there are several questions you should always be asking yourself. Was there any pre-crime association or contact? What was the degree or extent of that relationship, if one existed? Was this person a victim of opportunity, or were they specifically targeted? Did the victim contribute in any way to their victimization? And, of course, if so, how? For example, was it due to their ignorance, not knowing, their own innocence, again, not knowing, not realizing they were in a danger spot, naivete or recklessness on their part, or pure negligence? And there again, maybe even a total disregard for risk. You also need to think about the degree of any pre-planning or premeditation and forethought that might have gone into this attack and subsequent death. Was this a crime of passion? Was it an impulsive act? Or was it something that unfolded spontaneously? Then look at the offender side. What level of criminal experience or sophistication are we seeing, for example, in the crime scene or in the manner in which the victim was killed? What was the motive, or do we see anything indicating that to us? Was this victim the intended target again, or a substitute for someone else, either by chance or by design? What was the offender's attitude toward the victim? Can we tell that from looking at the scene or the injuries on the victim? Sometimes we can. Now, keep in mind, these are not academic questions. These are investigative questions that need to be answered, if at all possible, during the course of putting together the victimology and the suspectology assessments for your case. Now let's go a little further into understanding those risk factors that I mentioned before and some examples. So let's go with number one here. Low victim risk and pre-association. In other words, the lower the victim's risk level relative to the crime, the higher the probability that there was some form of a prior association between the victim and the offender. And as an example, imagine a married woman whose life revolves around her husband and children. Her activities are mostly domestic. Her risk level is inherently low. But now let's change that situation a little. Let's suppose she gets in her car and drives to go shopping or visit a friend. And her car breaks down in an unfamiliar area. Does that change anything? Yes, it does. Because the environment now has changed. And so does the risk. Even low-risk individuals can experience what we call situational spikes in vulnerability. By virtue of the breaking down of her car in an area that she was unfamiliar with, her risk factor has gone up to at least a medium, and maybe even higher depending on the location and situation. Let's go to number two. A low victim risk and targeted selection. When a victim's risk level is low, investigators must seriously consider whether the victim was specifically targeted or not. So let's go back to that same woman we talked about before, but a little different on the circumstances. It's early morning. It's around 5:30 a.m. Her husband leaves for work. At that point in time, she and her children are asleep. An intruder forces entry and threatens harm. That environment and that timing strongly suggests targeting, that the person was waiting for the husband to leave, had probably surveilled them over a period of time and knew when he left. Let's go on to another one, number 3. High victim risk and stranger offenders. As victim risk increases, the likelihood that the offender is a stranger also increases. And certain lifestyles expose individuals to frequent contact with unknown offenders, such as prostitution, runaway behavior, habitual drug use or drug addicts, or homeless, or gang members. These individuals are often referred to as devalued victims, not because their lives matter any less, but because offenders perceive them that way. No one cares about them. I can attack them and do what I want, and no one will do anything about it. Just a thought process that could exist. Let's now go to number 4, where we have high victim risk and opportunity crimes. The higher the risk level, the more likely the crime was one of opportunity. High-risk lifestyles attract predators who are actively looking for vulnerability. These offenders are often very patient. They may appear harmless. They wait for that opportunity, and when it presents itself, they strike. Now, let's move from that victimology stage of the process and transition to suspectology. But before I do this, I want to add another piece of statistical data that comes from a valid book and research written by Dr. Robert Keppel. One of his conclusions was that in 90% of the murder cases that he reviewed, he found the perpetrator's name was in the case file during the first 30 days of the investigation. In some, these were just simple witness interviews conducted during the preliminary or doing a canvassing of the neighborhood before any focus or attention was made towards any one specific individual. That said, suspectology is the development of suspects through the evaluation of events that occurred before, during, and after the homicide that can be linked to an offender. Many of these elements mirror what we assess in victimology and are referred to as offender risk factors. Here's the key point. A low-risk victim presents higher operational risk for the offender due to the exposure, whereas a high-risk victim presents lower operational risk to the offender. Understanding the victim alone is not enough. Investigators must also understand the suspect, their associations, their motivations, any precipitating events and interactions with the victim that may lead you to them. When you understand those dynamics, you increase your chances of identifying the offender, locating key witnesses, reducing resistance from reluctant sources, and conducting more effective interviews because you are armed with a significant amount of information. Now, guidelines for evaluating offender risk. At the scene, investigators should assess the time of day and location, unexpected reactions related to drugs or alcohol, whether the offender was maybe noticed or not, or remembered, whether they were possibly interrupted during the course of the attack, whether desire overrode common sense, whether the victim resisted more than anticipated, and whether the offender himself or herself might have been injured during the attack. After the crime, you need to assess certain things as well. Was physical evidence left behind? DNA, tools, maybe personal items. The offender had to alter or improvise their plan, as there may have been post-incident contact with law enforcement, which could explain those items and that evidence. And whether the crime appears planned or spontaneous. Now, in a future episode again, we will dedicate an entire session to the psychological indicators of planned versus unplanned crimes. And then this will fall into that very well, and you'll have a much better understanding when we get to that point. But this is also where we discussed earlier, if I recall, back in a couple of weeks ago or so, I talked about the 4 phases of homicide. And it especially comes into play when we're looking at pre-crime, crime, and post-crime behavior of suspects or persons of interest. And the fact that those 4 phases matter a lot. At the end of the day, the goal of the homicide investigators is simple, but not easy. It's to present a case to the prosecutor that is grounded in truthful, accurate, and well-documented information. When investigators understand the victim and the suspect, when they can clearly explain the motivation, the dynamics, and the interaction between all involved, the prosecutor is better positioned to explain the case to a jury. Now, that clarity minimizes the defense arguments and increases the likelihood of conviction. And that's why victimology and suspectology assessments matter. I want to thank you for listening. And if you have any questions about this podcast, the described processes that I gave you, or the forensic disciplines mentioned, please email me at jma.forensicinvestigator@gmail.com or visit my website at www.jma4ensics.com. Bye, everyone, and enjoy your day. Thank you.